A raft splinters on the open sea. A man clings to a single broken plank, salt water burning his eyes, his ship gone, his crew gone, 10 years of wandering behind him, and still no shore in sight. Above him, the sky darkens with a fury that feels almost personal, as if the sea itself has a grudge to settle, and in a way, it does. Somewhere beneath those waves, a god has not forgotten a single year of this man's suffering. This is the story of Odysseus, and of the god who tried, for a decade, to make sure he never went home. Hello and welcome to Europe After Midnight. Tonight we will travel into the world of ancient Greek myth, where gods walked among mortals and never forgot an insult. We will explore the moment one man's cleverness became his curse, in a cave on a lonely island. We will follow every storm, every monster, and every shipwreck that Poseidon, god of the sea, sent to punish him. We will examine how the Greeks understood divine anger, a force as real to them as gravity, as inescapable as the tide. And we will discover why only the quiet, constant protection of another god, Athena, kept this one mortal alive long enough to see his home again. But before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a wine-dark sea, under a sky ruled by gods who loved and hated with the same terrible intensity as the storms they commanded. To understand why Poseidon hunted one man for 10 years, you first have to understand what kind of god he was. The Greeks did not imagine their gods as distant or abstract. They imagined them as family, and like family, they could be generous, petty, loving, and cruel, often within the same afternoon. Poseidon was the god of the sea, but he was also the god of earthquakes, of horses, of the trembling ground beneath every mortal foot. The Greeks called him the Earth Shaker. Sailors prayed to him before every voyage, not because they trusted him, but because they feared him. A calm sea was a gift from Poseidon. A wrecked ship was also, quite often, a message from Poseidon. He was not a god who forgot easily. He was not a god who forgave quickly. And unlike the great skyfather Zeus, who ruled from Olympus with a certain cool detachment, Poseidon ruled from below, from the churning depths, where his moods and the ocean's moods were. In a very real sense, the same thing. When Poseidon was angry, ships sank. When Poseidon grieved, the sea grieved with him. This was not a metaphor to the ancient Greeks. It was simply how the world worked. The story of Poseidon's 10-year vendetta begins at the end of a much longer war. For 10 brutal years, the Greek armies had laid siege to the city of Troy, a conflict sparked by a stolen queen and fed by the pride of kings. It was a war of heroes, Achilles and Hector, Agamemnon and Priam, and it ended not through strength, but through cunning. A Greek soldier named Odysseus, king of a small, rocky island called Ithaca, devised the plan that finally broke the city's walls. He proposed building a massive wooden horse, hollow inside, and hiding a company of soldiers within it. The Trojans, believing it to be a peace offering, dragged the horse inside their own gates. That night, the hidden soldiers climbed out, opened the city to the waiting Greek army, and Troy burned before dawn. Odysseus was, by every measure the Greeks valued, the perfect hero. He was not the strongest man at Troy, he was not the fastest, and he was certainly not the most reckless in battle. What made Odysseus dangerous, and what made him famous, was his mind. The poet Homer gave him a title that followed him through every story, Odysseus of the many turns. His cleverness could talk his way out of a locked room or into a besieged city. This gift had won him the war. It was about to cost him almost everything else. When Troy finally fell, Odysseus gathered his men, loaded his 12 ships, and set sail for home. Ithaca was not far, a modest voyage by the standards of the ancient world, a matter of weeks if the winds were kind and the gods were quiet. Odysseus expected to be home in time to see his wife Penelope, and the son he had left behind as an infant, a boy named Telemachus, who would now be old enough to walk beside him. It should have been a short journey. It became instead one of the longest in all of literature, and the reason for that lay not in any weakness of Odysseus's own, but in a single, fateful stop his fleet made on the way. Odysseus and his 12 ships came within sight of a green, wild coastline. This coastline belonged to a people the Greeks called the Cyclopes, a race of giant, one-eyed shepherds who lived apart from the rest of the world, without laws, without assemblies, without the sacred customs that bound civilized men together. Each Cyclops lived alone in his own cave, tending his own flock, answering to no one. By every Greek standard, this was an uncivilized place. Odysseus, ever curious, ever certain his cleverness could carry him through any danger, decided to go ashore and see it for himself. He took 12 of his best men and a skin of powerful, unwatered wine, a gift he thought might prove useful. He left the rest of his fleet anchored safely offshore, on a small island within sight of the mainland, and led his small party toward a cave he could see cut into the hillside, its mouth sealed with a great slab of stone. Smoke curled from within. Someone was home. His men begged him to take what food he could find and leave before the owner returned. Odysseus refused. He wanted to see who lived there. He wanted, as he would later admit, to know if the stranger would offer them the hospitality that every civilized host owed a traveller, a sacred custom the Greeks called xenia, the guest friendship that bound host and stranger together under the watch of the gods themselves. It was a fair question to ask of any stranger's door. On this hillside, it was the worst question Odysseus would ever ask, because the cave belonged to a Cyclops named Polyphemus, and Polyphemus was no ordinary shepherd. He was a son of Poseidon, god of the sea, born to a sea nymph named Thusa, and though he lived alone on a distant hillside herding sheep, his father was the same god who ruled every wave between that island and Ithaca. Odysseus did not know this yet. He would learn it, in the darkest way possible, before that day was through. And what happened next? Inside that stone cave, sealed by a boulder no ordinary man could move, would not simply cost Odysseus a handful of soldiers. It would cost him 10 years of his life and very nearly his soul. The cave was larger than any dwelling Odysseus's men had ever seen, more a stone hall than a shepherd's hut. Pens of lambs and kids lined the walls, and great baskets brimmed with cheese, the work, it seemed, of a single enormous hand. The men urged Odysseus again to take what they needed and go. Again he refused. He wanted to meet the owner of this strange, silent household. He wanted to see if hospitality lived here, the way it lived in every civilized home he had ever entered. He would soon learn that some doors are better left unopened. They did not have to wait long. A shadow fell across the cave mouth, vast enough to blot out the afternoon light, and Polyphemus came home. He was not simply large. He was enormous beyond any human scale, a single wide eye set in the centre of his forehead, his flock driven before him like toys before a mountain. He rolled a boulder across the entrance behind him, a stone so massive that Odysseus later said 22 wagons could not have dragged it from its place. The sound of its sealing shut was the sound of a trap closing. Polyphemus noticed his guests only once his evening chores were done. He asked, in a voice like distant thunder, who these strangers were and what business had brought them to his home. Odysseus answered carefully. He explained that they were Greek soldiers returning from the sack of Troy, blown off course by hard winds, and he invoked the sacred custom that governed such meetings between host and stranger. He asked for the hospitality that Zeus himself was said to protect, the guest right owed to any traveller who came in peace. Polyphemus laughed. It was not a kind sound. He told Odysseus plainly that the Cyclopes cared nothing for Zeus, nothing for the customs of lesser men, and that he would treat his guests however he pleased. Then, without further ceremony, he reached down, seized 2 of Odysseus's men, and killed them where they stood. He ate them for his supper, washed down with fresh milk, while the surviving Greeks watched in horror from the shadows of the cave, unable to move, unable to speak, trapped behind a stone none of them could hope to shift alone. Odysseus's first instinct, he later admitted, was to draw his sword and strike the giant down as he slept. But even in his fear, his mind kept working. If he killed Polyphemus, they would still be sealed inside the cave, with no strength among them to move that boulder from the entrance. They would die there anyway, trapped with a corpse. So Odysseus did what he always did best. He waited, and he thought. The next morning, Polyphemus killed and ate 2 more men before driving his flock out to pasture, rolling the great stone back into place behind him as easily as another man might shut a garden gate. Odysseus spent that long, terrible day forming a plan, and it began with a length of olive wood, green and heavy, that lay drying near the cave's back wall, the shepherd's own walking staff, thick as a ship's mast. Odysseus and his remaining men sharpened one end to a point, hardened it in the fire, and hid it beneath a pile of dung on the cave floor. That evening, Polyphemus returned, and before he settled down to rest, 2 more men were dead, 6 of Odysseus's crew lost in a day and a half. Only then, with the giant slumping back against the cave wall, did Odysseus make his move. He approached the giant, not with a weapon, but with the skin of strong wine he had carried from the ships, undiluted, far stronger than anything the Cyclops had ever tasted. He offered it as a gift. Polyphemus drank it eagerly, cup after cup, and found it good. He asked the clever little stranger his name, promising, with something almost like drunken warmth, to give him a guest gift in return. Odysseus answered him with the single cleverest lie in all of Greek myth. He said his name was Nobody. Polyphemus, laughing, swaying now with the wine, said that he would grant Nobody one favour. He would eat him last, after all his companions. He meant it as a joke. It would become his undoing. The wine did its work quickly. Polyphemus slumped back against the cave wall and fell into a heavy sleep, wine and mutton spilling from his open mouth. Odysseus and his men drew out the hidden stake, heated its point once more in the dying coals of the fire until it glowed, and together, with a strength born of pure desperation, they drove it into the giant's single eye and turned it, the way a shipwright turns a drill through a beam of wood, spinning it steadily until the work is done. The scream that followed shook the walls of the cave. Polyphemus tore the stake free and stumbled, blind and roaring, groping along the walls in agony. Outside, the other Cyclopes of the hillside heard his cries and gathered at the sealed entrance, calling in to ask what was wrong, whether some enemy was attacking him in the night. Polyphemus shouted back the only answer his wine-soaked mind could form. "Nobody," he cried. "Nobody is killing me." His neighbours, hearing this, saw no cause for alarm. If nobody was attacking him, they reasoned, then there was nothing to be done, and they returned to their own caves and their own beds, leaving Polyphemus alone with his pain and his blindness, and with the men he still meant to kill. Morning came, and with it a new problem. Polyphemus still had to let his flock out to graze, and he still meant to catch his remaining captives if they tried to slip past him through the cave mouth. He rolled the stone aside and sat in the entrance, his huge hands sweeping the air above the backs of each sheep as it passed, feeling for any man who might try to walk out disguised among them. Odysseus, watching this from the shadows, understood the danger, and once again his mind found the gap that brute strength never could have found. He selected the giant's finest rams, the largest and strongest in the flock, and bound them together in threes with braided willow branches taken from the shepherd's own bedding. Beneath the belly of each middle ram he tied one of his men, hidden between the animal's legs, where Polyphemus's searching hands would never think to reach. For himself, Odysseus chose the single largest ram in the flock, and clung beneath its woolly underside with his own 2 hands, trusting his life to an animal's stride and a blind giant's grief. One by one, the rams filed out through the cave mouth into the pale morning light. Polyphemus ran his hands over each broad back as it passed, feeling nothing but wool. When the last ram, the largest of all, came slowly through the opening, its pace heavier than the rest under its hidden burden, the giant paused. He spoke to the animal directly, his voice thick with sorrow, asking why it lagged behind today of all days, when usually it led the flock, swift and proud, to be first at the fresh grass, and first to the cool stream, and last to return to the fold at evening. He said it seemed to grieve for its master's ruined eye, blinded, he said bitterly, by a wretch called Nobody, and his cowardly friends, who had gotten him helpless with wine before they struck. He let the ram pass. Once outside, once safely beyond the reach of those groping hands, Odysseus released his hold and freed his men from beneath the animals. They ran for the shore, driving as many of the giant's own sheep before them as they could manage, and did not stop running until they reached the safety of their ship. His crew hauled the animals aboard, and Odysseus, of all the choices he made that long and terrible day, made one more, a small one, that would prove to be the costliest decision of his entire voyage home. The cave was larger than any dwelling Odysseus's men had ever seen, more a stone hall than a shepherd's hut. Pens of lambs and kids lined the walls, and great baskets brimmed with cheese, the work, it seemed, of a single enormous hand. The men urged Odysseus again to take what they needed and go. Again he refused. He wanted to meet the owner of this strange, silent household. He wanted to see if hospitality lived here, the way it lived in every civilized home he had ever entered. He would soon learn that some doors are better left unopened. They did not have to wait long. A shadow fell across the cave mouth, vast enough to blot out the afternoon light, and Polyphemus came home. He was not simply large. He was enormous beyond any human scale, a single wide eye set in the centre of his forehead, his flock driven before him like toys before a mountain. He rolled a boulder across the entrance behind him, a stone so massive that Odysseus later said 22 wagons could not have dragged it from its place. The sound of its sealing shut was the sound of a trap closing. Polyphemus noticed his guests only once his evening chores were done. He asked, in a voice like distant thunder, who these strangers were and what business had brought them to his home. Odysseus answered carefully. He explained that they were Greek soldiers returning from the sack of Troy, blown off course by hard winds, and he invoked the sacred custom that governs such meetings between host and stranger. He asked for the hospitality that Zeus himself was said to protect, the guest right owed to any traveller who came in peace. Polyphemus laughed. It was not a kind sound. He told Odysseus plainly that the Cyclopes cared nothing for Zeus, nothing for the customs of lesser men, and that he would treat his guests however he pleased. Then, without further ceremony, he reached down, seized 2 of Odysseus's men, and killed them where they stood. He ate them for his supper, washed down with fresh milk, while the surviving Greeks watched in horror from the shadows of the cave, unable to move, unable to speak, trapped behind a stone none of them could hope to shift alone. Odysseus's first instinct, he later admitted, was to draw his sword and strike the giant down as he slept. But even in his fear, his mind kept working. If he killed Polyphemus, they would still be sealed inside the cave, with no strength among them to move that boulder from the entrance. They would die there anyway, trapped with a corpse. So Odysseus did what he always did best. He waited, and he thought. The next morning, Polyphemus killed and ate 2 more men before driving his flock out to pasture, rolling the great stone back into place behind him as easily as another man might shut a garden gate. Odysseus spent that long, terrible day forming a plan, and it began with a length of olive wood, green and heavy, that lay drying near the cave's back wall, the shepherd's own walking staff, thick as a ship's mast. Odysseus and his remaining men sharpened one end to a point, hardened it in the fire, and hid it beneath a pile of dung on the cave floor. That evening, Polyphemus returned, and before he settled down to rest, 2 more men were dead, 6 of Odysseus's crew lost in a day and a half. Only then, with the giant slumping back against the cave wall, did Odysseus make his move. He approached the giant, not with a weapon, but with the skin of strong wine he had carried from the ships, undiluted, far stronger than anything the Cyclops had ever tasted. He offered it as a gift. Polyphemus drank it eagerly, cup after cup, and found it good. He asked the clever little stranger his name, promising, with something almost like drunken warmth, to give him a guest gift in return. Odysseus answered him with the single cleverest lie in all of Greek myth. He said his name was Nobody. Polyphemus, laughing, swaying now with the wine, said that he would grant Nobody one favour. He would eat him last, after all his companions. He meant it as a joke. It would become his undoing. The wine did its work quickly. Polyphemus slumped back against the cave wall and fell into a heavy sleep, wine and mutton spilling from his open mouth. Odysseus and his men drew out the hidden stake, heated its point once more in the dying coals of the fire until it glowed, and together, with a strength born of pure desperation, they drove it into the giant's single eye and turned it, the way a shipwright turns a drill through a beam of wood, spinning it steadily until the work is done. The scream that followed shook the walls of the cave. Polyphemus tore the stake free and stumbled, blind and roaring, groping along the walls in agony. Outside, the other cyclopes of the hillside heard his cries and gathered at the sealed entrance, calling in to ask what was wrong, whether some enemy was attacking him in the night. Polyphemus shouted back the only answer his wine-soaked mind could form. "Nobody," he cried. "Nobody is killing me." His neighbours, hearing this, saw no cause for alarm. If nobody was attacking him, they reasoned, then there was nothing to be done, and they returned to their own caves and their own beds, leaving Polyphemus alone with his pain and his blindness, and with the men he still meant to kill. Morning came, and with it a new problem. Polyphemus still had to let his flock out to graze, and he still meant to catch his remaining captives if they tried to slip past him through the cave mouth. He rolled the stone aside and sat in the entrance, his huge hands sweeping the air above the backs of each sheep as it passed, feeling for any man who might try to walk out disguised among them. Odysseus, watching this from the shadows, understood the danger, and once again his mind found the gap that brute strength never could have found. He selected the giant's finest rams, the largest and strongest in the flock, and bound them together in threes with braided willow branches taken from the shepherd's own bedding. Beneath the belly of each middle ram he tied one of his men, hidden between the animal's legs, where Polyphemus's searching hands would never think to reach. For himself, Odysseus chose the single largest ram in the flock, and clung beneath its woolly underside with his own 2 hands, trusting his life to an animal's stride and a blind giant's grief. One by one, the rams filed out through the cave mouth into the pale morning light. Polyphemus ran his hands over each broad back as it passed, feeling nothing but wool. When the last ram, the largest of all, came slowly through the opening, its pace heavier than the rest under its hidden burden, the giant paused. He spoke to the animal directly, his voice thick with sorrow, asking why it lagged behind today of all days, when usually it led the flock, swift and proud, to be first at the fresh grass, and first to the cool stream, and last to return to the fold at evening. He said it seemed to grieve for its master's ruined eye, blinded, he said bitterly, by a wretch called Nobody, and his cowardly friends, who had gotten him helpless with wine before they struck. He let the ram pass. Once outside, once safely beyond the reach of those groping hands, Odysseus released his hold and freed his men from beneath the animals. They ran for the shore, driving as many of the giant's own sheep before them as they could manage, and did not stop running until they reached the safety of their ship. His crew hauled the animals aboard, and Odysseus, of all the choices he made that long and terrible day, made one more, a small one, that would prove to be the costliest decision of his entire voyage home. The ship pulled away from the shore, oars biting deep into the water, putting distance between the crew and the cave where they had so nearly died. Odysseus should have stayed silent. He had his men back, or most of them. He had a holdful of stolen sheep and a story that would make him famous around every hearth in Greece. He had, in every practical sense, already won. But there was one part of Odysseus that no danger had ever fully tamed, and no triumph had ever fully satisfied, and that was his pride. As the ship reached what he judged to be a safe distance, close enough to shout across the water but far enough to escape a thrown rock, Odysseus rose at the stern and called back toward the cave mouth. He mocked the giant, telling him that his blinding was payment for his cruelty to guests who had come to his door in peace. He gave no name. He wanted Polyphemus to know only that he had lost, not who had beaten him. Polyphemus, hearing a stranger's voice where he expected silence, tore the peak from a nearby hill, a boulder of a size no mortal arm should have been able to lift, and hurled it toward the sound. It fell just short of the ship's prow, close enough that the wave it raised nearly drove the vessel back onto the rocks of the very shore they were fleeing. The crew rowed harder, driving the ship twice as far from the island, and for a moment it seemed the danger had passed. It had not. Odysseus, flush with the thrill of the escape, opened his mouth to shout again, and this time his men physically restrained him, pleading with him to let the matter rest, to let the giant rage in silence and the wind carry them safely home. He would not listen. He shook them off and called out once more, and this time he gave the giant everything he had withheld before. "Not nobody," he shouted, "but Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. Let it be known," he cried, who had bested him. Blinded, humiliated, and now certain of his enemy's identity, Polyphemus did something no ordinary shepherd could have done. He lifted his arms toward the heavens and prayed, not to any god of the hillside or the hearth, but to his own father, the god of the sea itself. He asked Poseidon to see that Odysseus never reached his home, and if the fates had already decided that Odysseus must return to Ithaca, he asked instead that his enemy arrive late and broken, having lost all his companions along the way, and find only ruin waiting for him when at last he did. To modern ears, this might sound like the empty curse of a wounded, furious man, the kind of thing shouted in anger and forgotten by morning. To the Greeks who first told this story, and to every listener who heard it recited by firelight for centuries afterward, it was nothing of the sort. The Greeks understood it as the opening of a divine campaign that would last a decade. To understand what that prayer actually set in motion, it helps to remember what Polyphemus had just done with his own hands. He had not simply cursed his enemy in the heat of the pain. He had raised his arms toward the sky and asked his father, by name, to collect a debt. That single gesture was the whole of Greek religion in miniature. The Olympian gods were not distant lawgivers, dispensing justice from some cosmic bench. They were parents, the way Poseidon was a parent, personally invested in the fortunes of their children and their own wounded pride. And a god's anger did not cool with time the way a mortal's might. It could simmer for years, decades, even generations, exactly the way it now would for Poseidon and for Odysseus. A deeper principle lay buried inside that prayer, one that would have struck every ancient listener as the true heart of the story. Odysseus had violated Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality that bound host and guest together under the god's own protection. But the law cut both ways. Polyphemus had broken it first, devouring the guests who had come peacefully to his door instead of offering them shelter and a meal. In the strictest sense, the Cyclops was the one who had sinned against the god's own custom, and Odysseus, blinding him, had only answered violence with violence in a desperate bid to save his remaining men. A blinding, though, was never simply an injury in the world of Greek myth. It carried a permanent public humiliation, the kind of wound that could never be quietly settled or paid off with gold, the kind that demanded an answer in kind or in blood. And so what looked, on the surface, like a fair fight between a clever man and a monstrous captor was, underneath, something far more complicated. 2 guest laws had been broken in the same encounter, and only one god had a father in a position to do anything about it. That imbalance is the true engine of everything that follows. It did not matter to Poseidon that his son had eaten Odysseus's men first. It did not matter that Odysseus had acted to save the rest of his crew from the same fate. What mattered, in the strict and unforgiving accounting of the Olympian gods, was that his son had stood on that hillside and called out to him by name. A father god, hearing that prayer, was bound by something very like honour to answer it. One more piece of misfortune lay buried inside that cave, one that Odysseus could not have known and would not learn until much later in his journey. Among the ancient prophecies whispered about the world, it had long been foretold that a man named Odysseus would one day come and take the sight of Polyphemus's single eye. The giant, it was said, had always imagined this enemy as some great and terrible warrior, a hero of towering size and strength, someone worthy of such a fate. Instead, he had been undone by a modestly built stranger with a clever tongue, a skin of strong wine, and a trick with a name. It made the humiliation sharper, and it made Poseidon's fury, when the prayer reached him beneath the waves, burn all the more for how easily his son had been outwitted. The ship sailed on that evening, its crew rowing in grim silence, the island of the Cyclopes shrinking behind them into the dusk. Odysseus stood at the stern for a long while, watching the darkening water where his enemy's voice had finally fallen silent. He did not yet understand what he had done. He believed, as any man might, that he had won a battle, escaped with his life, and earned a story worth telling for the rest of his days. He had no way of knowing that somewhere beneath that same darkening water, a god was already listening, already remembering every word of his son's prayer, and already beginning to plan. The winds that carried Odysseus's ships away from that island that night were, for the moment, still kind. They would not stay that way for long. Somewhere ahead of him, across a decade of open water, a god who ruled every wave he would ever cross was waiting, patient as the tide, for his chance to answer a son's prayer in full. For a time, it seemed the gods might let the matter rest. The fleet sailed on through calm waters, and after some weeks, they came within sight of a floating island ringed with sheer bronze cliffs, the home of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus was no ordinary king. Zeus himself had granted him mastery over every gust and gale in the world, and he welcomed Odysseus as an honoured guest, feasting him for a full month and listening, night after night, to the whole long story of the war at Troy. When at last Odysseus prepared to leave, Aeolus gave him a parting gift unlike any other in the ancient world. He took every contrary wind that might blow a ship off its course, gathered them together, and sealed them inside a great ox-hide bag, bound shut with a silver cord. Only the gentle west wind was left free, to blow Odysseus's ship steadily home. Aeolus placed the bag in the hold of Odysseus's own ship with his own hands, and warned him never to loosen that cord until Ithaca's shores came into view. For 9 days, it worked exactly as promised. The west wind carried the fleet steadily eastward, and on the 10th day, the cliffs of Ithaca finally rose on the horizon, close enough that Odysseus could make out the watchfires burning on his own shore. Exhausted from 9 sleepless days at the helm, certain his ordeal was finally over, he allowed himself to close his eyes and rest. It was then that his own crew undid him. They had watched Aeolus hand their captain a mysterious bag in private, and for 9 long days they had wondered what treasure it might hold. Gold, perhaps, or silver. Some king's ransom Odysseus meant to keep for himself. While he slept, driven by curiosity and a very human resentment at being left out of their captain's fortune, they loosened the silver cord. Every wind Aeolus had bound inside came howling out at once, and the fleet was hurled backward across the very sea they had just crossed, all the way back to Aeolus's floating island. When Odysseus, humiliated, begged the Wind King for help a second time, Aeolus refused him outright, declaring that any man so plainly cursed by the gods was not a man he dared to help again. Home had been within sight. Now it was, once more, impossibly far. From there, the fleet sailed on into far darker waters, and it was here that Poseidon's hand, though never named outright by the poet, seemed to guide them toward the next disaster. They came to the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants who lived along a harbour so narrow and so perfectly sheltered that 11 of Odysseus's 12 captains sailed their ships straight inside without a second thought, glad, after so many storms, to find calm water at last. Odysseus alone held back, some old caution keeping his own ship anchored just outside the harbour mouth. That single decision saved his life. The Laestrygonians revealed themselves to be monstrous in size and monstrous in appetite. From the cliffs above the harbour, they hurled boulders down onto the trapped fleet, smashing hull after hull like a child stamping on toys, and then waded into the wreckage to spear the drowning sailors like men spearing fish from a stream. 11 ships were destroyed in a matter of minutes, and every man aboard them was killed. Odysseus, watching from outside the harbour, could do nothing but cut his own anchor cable and flee with the single ship that remained to him. He had left Troy with 12 ships and hundreds of men. He now had 1 ship and a crew that had been cut nearly in half. A broken and grieving company finally made landfall on the island of Circe, a sorceress of formidable power who lived alone in a great stone hall, ringed by wolves and lions. The animals moved with an unsettling, unnatural gentleness. These were not truly beasts at all, but men Circe had transformed with her enchantments. Odysseus sent half his remaining crew ahead to scout the island, and Circe welcomed them warmly, offering wine and a rich feast. Hidden in that feast was a drug of her own devising, and one touch of her wand turned every man who had eaten it into a pig, their minds still human, trapped now inside the bodies of swine. Only 1 man escaped to bring word back to the ship, and Odysseus, sword in hand, set out alone to confront the witch and save what remained of his crew. On the path to her hall, he was met by the god Hermes, messenger of Olympus. Hermes gave him a rare herb called moly, a plant with a black root and a white flower, and its power would protect him from Circe's enchantment. Fortified by this gift, Odysseus ate at her table, drank her enchanted wine, and felt nothing when she struck him with her wand. Astonished that her magic had failed, and disarmed by his cleverness, Circe recognized at once that this could only be Odysseus, a man the gods themselves had long spoken of. She restored his transformed men to their true shapes, and what began as an ambush ended, unexpectedly, in an entire year of comfort and rest, as Odysseus and his remaining crew stayed on as her honored guests. But comfort, in these stories, is never permanent, and eventually Odysseus asked Circe how he might finally find his way home. Her answer was not a course to steer or a wind to catch. It was a journey no living man wanted to make. She told him he must sail to the edge of the world, to the land of the dead itself, and there summon the spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias, for only the dead could tell him the truth of what lay ahead. Odysseus obeyed. He sailed to the farthest edge of the known ocean, to a shore of endless mist and darkness, where the sun never shone, and there, following Circe's instructions exactly, he dug a pit and poured offerings of milk, honey, and wine into the earth, and finally the blood of a black ram, to draw the spirits of the dead up from below. Ghost after ghost came crowding around the pit, thin and whispering, hungry for the blood that might let them speak. But Odysseus held his sword ready, and let none of them near until the shade of Tiresias himself came forward to drink. What the prophet told him confirmed everything Odysseus had feared since that day on the beach outside the Cyclops' cave. Poseidon, Tiresias said, still burned with anger over the blinding of his son, and would make certain that Odysseus' journey home was long and hard, and marked by loss at every turn. Yet the prophet also offered a narrow path through the danger. Odysseus would reach Ithaca, Tiresias promised, though late and alone, and only if he and his men committed no further offence along the way. One final test still awaited him, the prophet warned, one that would decide whether he returned home broken but alive, or lost forever beneath the waves. Somewhere ahead, Tiresias said, lay an island called Thrinacia, sacred to the sun god Helios, where cattle of a purity beyond anything in the mortal world grazed under his watchful eye. If Odysseus and his men sailed past that island and touched nothing, harming no single animal in that sacred herd, they might yet reach home, scarred but whole. But if any man laid a hand on those cattle, Tiresias warned, then Odysseus would lose every companion who sailed with him and would come home at last, not as a captain returning with his crew, but as a single survivor, arriving in a stranger's boat to find his own household in ruins. Odysseus listened to every word in silence. He had already lost 11 ships and hundreds of men to a harbour full of giants. He had already watched his pride, on a distant beach, turn a wounded monster's cry into a father's curse. Now he carried a prophet's warning as well, a warning that named the very island where his own men, starving and desperate after months at sea, would one day be tested past the limit of their endurance. He thanked the spirit of Tiresias, made his way back to the world of the living, and returned to Circe's island to gather his crew for the next leg of a voyage that, he now understood, was never simply a matter of wind and current. Somewhere beneath every wave that lay ahead of him, a god was still watching, still waiting, and still very far from finished. Circe welcomed Odysseus back to her island one final time, and before she let him sail on, she gave him something even more valuable than Tiresias's warning, the exact shape of the dangers waiting ahead, and how a clever man might survive each one. She told him of the sirens first, creatures whose voices were said to be so beautiful that no sailor who heard their song could resist steering toward it, straight onto the rocks where the bones of every previous listener lay bleaching in the sun. She told him next to a narrow strait beyond the Sirens' Island, a passage so treacherous that no ship had ever sailed through it unscathed, guarded on either side by two horrors that no mortal strength could hope to defeat. And she told him too of the island that waited beyond that strait, the sacred pastures of the sun god Helios, and she repeated, almost word for word, the same warning Tiresias had given him in the land of the dead. Whatever else happened, whatever hunger or desperation his men might feel, those cattle must not be touched. Odysseus sailed from her island with this knowledge weighing on him like ballast, and it was not long before the first of Circe's warnings came due. As the ship approached the Sirens' island, he did as she had instructed. He took a wheel of soft beeswax, warmed it in his hands until it was pliable, and packed it firmly into the ears of every man at the oars, so that not one of them would hear a single note of the coming song. For himself, he had asked for something different. He wanted to hear the Sirens' voices and live to tell of it, and so he ordered his men to bind him tightly to the ship's mast with heavy rope, and made them swear that no matter what he said or how he begged once the song began, they were not to loosen those bindings until the island was well behind them. The Sirens' voices, when they came, were everything Circe had promised and worse. They called to Odysseus by name, promising him knowledge of all things past and yet to come, praising his glory at Troy in words so sweet and so precisely tailored to his own vanity that he strained against his ropes with every fibre of his strength, twisting and shouting at his men to cut him free. His deaf and oar-bound crew, following his own earlier orders exactly, only rowed harder and bound him tighter, until at last the island fell away behind them, and the terrible, beautiful song faded into the ordinary sound of wind and water. Odysseus later admitted he was the only living man ever to hear that song and sail on. There was no time to celebrate the escape. Ahead lay the strait Circe had warned him of, and as the ship entered its narrow channel, Odysseus could see the danger on both sides at once, just as she had described it. To one side rose a sheer cliff, and hidden within a cave halfway up its face lived Scylla, a monster with 6 long necks and 6 snapping heads, each mouth lined with 3 rows of teeth. She never left her cave, but her necks could stretch out over the water to snatch sailors from a passing deck, 1 victim in each mouth, 6 men lost in the span of a single breath. To the other side of the strait, close enough that a ship trying to avoid Scylla would sail directly into its reach, was Charybdis. Not a monster in any shape a sailor could fight, but a whirlpool of tremendous power, one that swallowed the sea itself 3 times a day and spat it back out again, capable of dragging an entire ship down into the depths with everyone aboard. Circe had been honest with him about the choice this strait demanded, and it was a choice with no good answer. He could steer close to Charybdis and risk losing the whole ship and every man aboard to the whirlpool, or he could steer close to Scylla and lose only 6 men, snatched from the deck while the rest of the crew rowed on to safety. She had told him plainly that 6 deaths were a smaller price than the total loss of everyone, and had advised him, for once, not to fight, but simply to row past Scylla's cliff as swiftly as his oars could carry him, and accept the loss. Odysseus made the choice Circe had counselled, though he could not bring himself to tell his men what was coming, fearing that if they knew, they might drop their oars in terror and doom the whole ship to Charybdis instead. He armed himself, out of some private, human refusal, to simply let his men die without a fight, though Circe had warned him it would do no good. As the ship passed beneath the cliff, Scylla's 6 heads shot down at once, and in an instant 6 of his best remaining men were lifted, screaming from the deck, their arms outstretched toward their captain, calling his name one final time before they vanished into the monster's cave. Odysseus later said it was the single most pitiful sight of his entire voyage, worse, in its way, than anything else the sea had shown him, precisely because he had known it was coming and could do nothing to stop it. The ship rowed on, grieving and diminished, and not long after, exactly as both Tiresias and Circe had foretold, the island of Thrinacia rose on the horizon, its green pastures dotted with cattle of a beauty and stillness that seemed to belong to no ordinary herd. Odysseus, remembering every warning he had been given, wanted to sail past without even setting foot on the shore. But his men, exhausted, grieving their 6 lost companions, and worn down by months without a proper rest, begged him to let them land for just 1 night, promising to eat only the provisions still left in the ship's stores and to leave the sacred cattle untouched. Against his own better judgment, Odysseus agreed, but only after making every man swear a solemn oath that no one would harm a single animal on that island. The oath was held only as long as the wind allowed them to leave. A storm rose the very next day and did not relent. It blew for a full month, trapping the ship and its starving crew on that island long after their food stores had run dry. The men fished what little they could and hunted what small game the island offered, but it was never enough, and slowly, inevitably, hunger began to eat away at the promise they had made. One day, while Odysseus slept, exhausted from yet another sleepless watch, his men gave in. They told themselves that if they survived to return home, they would build Helios a magnificent temple to atone for the theft, and if they did not survive, better to die well fed by the sword than starving and slow. They slaughtered several of the sacred cattle, roasted the meat, and ate. Odysseus woke to the smell of the offence already committed, and there was nothing left to do but grieve for what he knew was coming. Helios, discovering the theft of his sacred herd, was so enraged that he went to Zeus himself and threatened, if he were not given justice, to take his son down into the underworld and shine there instead, leaving the whole world in permanent darkness. Zeus, unwilling to lose the sun from the sky, promised he would deal with the guilty men himself. The punishment came without warning. Once the storm finally broke and Odysseus's ship put back out to open water, Zeus split the sky with black clouds and struck the ship directly with a bolt of lightning, splitting the hull in two and hurling every man aboard into the churning sea. Every one of them drowned, save for Odysseus alone, who managed to lash together the broken mast and keel with a length of rope and cling to this makeshift raft as the wreckage of his ship and the last of his crew disappeared beneath the waves around him. It is worth noticing, at this point in the story, that this final and most devastating loss was not, strictly speaking, Poseidon's doing at all. Zeus cast the lightning, and Helios demanded it. But this was precisely the outcome Tiresias had warned of in the land of the dead, and precisely the ruin that Poseidon's grudge had been steering Odysseus toward for years, storm by storm, disaster by disaster, wearing down a fleet of 12 ships and hundreds of men until nothing remained of it but hunger, desperation, and one final, fatal meal. The god of the sea had not needed to strike the final blow himself. He had simply needed to make certain that Odysseus arrived at that island broken enough and starved enough that his men would break their oath. Now, clinging to a splintered mast in the middle of an empty ocean, utterly alone for the first time since he had left the shores of Troy, Odysseus drifted back through the very strait he had so carefully survived once already, past Charybdis, which nearly swallowed even this last fragment of his ship, and out into open water, carried by currents he could no longer control, toward a fate that only the gods, watching from above and below, could yet decide. 9 days Odysseus drifted on the wreckage of his ship, carried by currents through the same treacherous strait he had crossed only weeks before, past the reach of Charybdis a second time, alone now with no oars to guide him and no crew left to mourn. On the 10th day, exhausted past the point of caring where the sea might take him, he washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, a green and isolated paradise ringed by forests of alder and cypress, where a single goddess lived in a cave laced with grapevines and cooled by 4 clear springs. Her name was Calypso, and she found him half drowned on her shore, the last living remnant of 12 ships and a war's worth of soldiers. Calypso took him in, and what began as rescue slowly became something closer to captivity. She was taken with him immediately, and offered him a life that most mortal men could only dream of. Comfort, safety, her own devoted companionship, and even, she promised, immortality itself. If only he would stay with her forever and forget the rocky little kingdom he had left behind. For 7 long years, Odysseus remained on that island, fed and sheltered and wanted by a goddess. And yet, as the poet tells it, he spent his days sitting alone on the shore, staring out at the horizon, weeping for a wife, a son, and a home he had not seen in nearly 2 decades. During these 7 years, the balance of power on Olympus finally began to shift in Odysseus's favour, though not through any effort of his own. Far above the wine-dark sea, the goddess Athena had never abandoned him. She was the daughter of Zeus himself, goddess of wisdom and strategic cunning, and from the very beginning of Odysseus's long ordeal, she had been his fiercest and most patient advocate among the gods. It was Athena who had guided the wooden horse's plan to its triumphant end at Troy. It was Athena who watched, year after year, as Poseidon's grudge dragged her favourite mortal from one disaster to the next, And it was Athena who finally decided that 7 years of suffering on a lonely island was enough. She waited, with the same patience the gods brought to every one of their grudges and their favours, for the one moment when she knew she could act freely, a day when Poseidon himself was absent from Olympus, travelling far to the south to receive sacrifices and honours from a distant, blameless people called the Ethiopians. With the sea god gone and unable to object, Athena rose before the assembled council of the gods and made her case for Odysseus directly to her father Zeus. She reminded him of every honour Odysseus had paid the gods, of his cleverness, his suffering, his unwavering longing for home, and she asked, at last, that he be allowed to return to Ithaca. Zeus agreed, and the decision was made. Hermes, messenger of Olympus, was sent to Calypso's island to deliver the command directly. She must let Odysseus go. Calypso was furious and bitter, pointing out, not unreasonably, that the male gods seemed to resent any goddess who dared to love a mortal man, while they themselves took mortal lovers freely and without consequence. But a command from Zeus could not be refused, and so, with deep reluctance, she helped Odysseus build a sturdy raft, gave him the tools, the timber, and the provisions he would need, and finally sent him on his way, 7 years after the sea had first washed him onto her shore. For 17 days, the raft sailed on calm water under a favourable wind, and Odysseus, steering by the stars just as Calypso had instructed him, began at last to believe that his long ordeal might truly be nearing its end. On the 18th day, he sighted land, the dim shape of a mountainous coastline rising from the sea, and allowed himself, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, something close to hope. At that exact moment, Poseidon returned from his journey among the Ethiopians. Approaching Olympus from a great distance out at sea, he happened to glance down at the water below him and saw, with an anger that had never once cooled in all the years of his absence, the raft of Odysseus sailing steadily toward the shore of Phaeacia, a kingdom that, if he reached it, might finally offer him safe passage home. Every other god on Olympus had conspired to help this man while Poseidon's back was turned. He understood at once what had happened, and he understood too that he had almost no time left to answer it. What followed was the single most violent and most personal assault Poseidon ever launched against Odysseus in the entire 10 years of his wandering. Every earlier disaster, the storm that had scattered Aeolus's winds, the harbour of the Laestrygonians, the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, could be read as misfortune, as the natural hazards of a long and cursed voyage, guided by the god's grudge, but never delivered by his own hand. This time, Poseidon acted directly. He lifted his great trident, gathered the clouds of the sky into a single churning mass, and stirred both sea and land into chaos with his own divine strength. He unleashed every wind at once, east and south, and howling north and west together, so that they tore at the raft from every direction simultaneously, and he raised waves as tall as mountains, one after another, driving down upon the small craft that was all that stood between Odysseus and the deep. Odysseus, watching the sky darken and the sea rise around him, understood immediately what he was facing. He said, in that moment, that he knew his suffering was not yet finished, and that some new and terrible trial had found him at the very edge of safety. He was not wrong. A towering wave struck the raft broadside and swept him from it entirely, hurling him deep beneath the surface, and when he finally fought his way back up through the churning water, gasping for breath, he found the mast of his raft snapped and the sail torn away, the whole fragile craft on the verge of coming apart beneath him. He hauled himself back aboard and clung to the wreckage as wave after wave broke over him, the wind screaming across the water, the raft groaning and splintering with every impact, Poseidon's fury falling on him without pause or mercy, just as he had promised himself, all those years before, in the prayer of a blinded sun on a distant shore. In this moment, when the sea god's rage seemed certain to finish, at last, what it had begun a decade earlier, help arrived from an unexpected quarter. A sea goddess named Ino, who had once been a mortal woman before the gods raised her to divinity, took pity on Odysseus as she watched him battered nearly to death in the churning waves. She rose from the water beside his shattered raft and pressed into his hands a length of enchanted veil, telling him to bind it beneath his chest, to strip off the heavy clothing that would drag him under, and to abandon the raft entirely and swim for the shore. He could still, faintly, see ahead of him. The veil, she promised, would keep him from drowning, so long as he trusted it and let the wreckage go. Odysseus hesitated, uncertain whether to trust a stranger's gift in the middle of such violence, but the choice was made for him a moment later when Poseidon, seeing his enemy still clinging to life, struck the raft with one final, tremendous wave and scattered its timbers across the sea like a scarecrow's straw in a gale, exactly as the poet described it. Odysseus had no choice left but to do as Ino had told him. He tied the veil beneath his chest, let go of the last broken plank of his raft, and struck out swimming through waves that towered over his head, while Poseidon, watching from the depths, finally seemed to relent, satisfied at last, or perhaps simply certain that no mortal man could survive much longer in such a sea. Having done what he judged enough to punish the blinding of his son, the sea god turned away and withdrew to his palace beneath the waves, leaving the storm to finish its work. But even now, exhausted, waterlogged, and swimming alone in the open ocean with no raft and no land yet within his reach, Odysseus was not without protection. Athena, watching from Olympus, saw her chance the moment Poseidon turned away, and she acted swiftly. She calmed the worst of the remaining wind, holding back every gust but the one that blew directly toward the Phaeacian shore, and guided him steadily onward through the last of the storm's dying waves. For 2 full days and nights, Odysseus swam and drifted through open water at the very limit of human endurance, and on the 3rd day, as dawn broke calm and clear at last, he came within sight of the mouth of a river, its gentle current a mercy after everything the sea had thrown against him. He prayed to the river god for safe passage, and the god, hearing him, stilled his current and let Odysseus swim ashore at last. He crawled from the water onto a bed of thick undergrowth beneath 2 olive trees, grown so closely together that not even the fiercest wind could find its way between them, and there, naked, salt-crusted, and utterly spent, the last survivor of 12 ships and a decade of divine punishment finally collapsed into a deep and dreamless sleep, while Athena, unseen, watched over him through the night, and the god who had hunted him across the length of the known world returned, for now, to his throne beneath the sea. Odysseus woke the next morning to the sound of young women laughing near the riverbank, and for a moment he must have wondered if the sea had finally driven him mad. It had not. The laughter belonged to Nausicaa, princess of the Phaeacians, who had come to the river with her handmaids to wash linens before her wedding, an errand the goddess Athena had planted in her dreams the night before, guiding her, without the girl ever knowing it, to precisely the stretch of shore where a broken, salt-crusted stranger lay sleeping beneath the olive trees. Odysseus emerged from the undergrowth, naked and wild-haired, crusted with dried brine, and every handmaid but Nausicaa fled in terror at the sight of him. She alone stood her ground, and it was Athena, watching from Olympus, who steadied the young princess's courage in that moment, filling her with a calm and a kindness that a lesser goddess's meddling might easily have stripped away. Nausicaa gave the stranger clothing, food, and oil to wash the salt from his skin, and Athena, unseen, made him taller and more radiant to look upon as he emerged from the river, so that Nausicaa turned to her handmaids and admitted, half to herself, that she would not mind a husband like this one, if the gods saw fit to send her one. She led him to the edge of her father's city and gave him careful instructions, for propriety's sake, on how to approach the palace and win her mother's favour, since it was the queen, she told him, whose goodwill decided every matter of importance in that court. Athena, walking beside him now in the guise of a young girl carrying a water jug, wrapped him in a protective mist so that he passed through the bustling city unseen and unquestioned, and led him straight to the palace doors before vanishing back to Olympus. Odysseus walked into the hall of King Alcinous and Queen Arete, knelt before the queen exactly as Nausicaa had instructed, and asked for their help in finally reaching home. The Phaeacians were a seafaring people unlike any other in the ancient world, renowned even among the gods for the speed and the almost magical certainty of their ships, vessels that needed no helmsman, that knew the thoughts of their passengers and carried them safely across any sea, no matter how far, in a single night. King Alcinous welcomed the stranger warmly, fed him at his own table, and asked, as any good host would, to hear his story. Odysseus told it all, from the sack of Troy to the cave of the Cyclops, from Circe's island to Calypso's shore, and the entire hall sat in stunned silence at the sheer scale of what one man had survived. When he finished, Alcinous promised him a ship, a crew, and safe passage home the very next day, gifts he offered freely, in the old spirit of Xenia that Odysseus himself had once invoked, in vain, at the mouth of a giant's cave. That night, loaded with gifts of gold and bronze and fine woven cloth, more treasure by far than he had carried away from the sack of Troy itself, Odysseus boarded the Phaeacian ship and fell into the deepest sleep he had known in 20 years, a sleep, the poet says, that was almost like death itself. So completely did it empty him of all the fear and vigilance that had kept him alive across a decade of wandering. The crew rowed through the night without a single word from their sleeping passenger, guiding the ship unerringly across open water by whatever strange gift the gods had given their people, and by dawn they had done what no other vessel could have done. They had carried him the entire distance home in a single voyage. They laid him, still deeply asleep, on the sand of a quiet cove on Ithaca, stacked his treasures carefully beside him where no thief would find them, and turned back for their own shore, their errand of mercy complete. But an errand of mercy toward Odysseus was, by now, an old and familiar insult to the god who had sworn to make his homecoming as bitter as possible, and Poseidon, watching this final act of kindness unfold, was not willing to let it pass unanswered. He went to Zeus and complained bitterly that the gods no longer honoured him as they once had, that mortals and immortals alike now dared to help his enemy reach home unharmed, right under his own trident, and he asked for permission to exact one last measure of vengeance, not against Odysseus himself, whom Zeus had already decreed must safely reach his home, but against the Phaeacians who had carried him there. Zeus granted his request on the condition that Poseidon wait until the ship had completed its voyage and was in full sight of its own harbour, so that all the Phaeacians might witness what befell it. Poseidon waited, patient as always, until the ship came within sight of home, its crew already slowing their oars, already glimpsing the familiar cliffs and the welcoming lights of their own city. Then, with a single downward strike of his hand, he turned the entire vessel to stone, exactly where it sat, rooting it forever in the harbour's mouth, a permanent monument, visible to every Phaeacian sailor from that day forward, of what it could cost to defy the will of the sea. King Alcinous, watching this happen from the shore, remembered an old prophecy his own father had once told him, that Poseidon would one day punish the Phaeacians for the very generosity that made their people famous for ferrying strangers safely across any sea without harm to themselves. Alcinous, in his grief, ordered his people to offer 12 of their finest bulls in sacrifice, and made them swear an oath never again to give safe passage to any castaway who washed up on their shore, whatever pity they might feel. It was, in its own way, the last and most bitter note in Poseidon's decade-long song of vengeance. Even in defeat, even after Odysseus finally stood again on his own native soil, the god of the sea found one more price to exact, one more shore where his anger would leave a permanent scar. Odysseus himself never saw it happen. He woke on the sand of that quiet cove, disoriented and afraid, not recognizing the shore of the very kingdom he had spent 20 years longing to see, for Athena had shrouded the whole island in mist to hide him from any enemy who might recognize him before he was ready to be known. She came to him there, disguised as a young shepherd, and when at last she revealed herself in her true form, she laughed gently at the sight of him, still trying, out of pure habit, to lie his way past a stranger, even now, even at the very end of his journey, on his own beach, in his own kingdom. She told him plainly that this was exactly why she loved him above all other mortal men, that among all the clever, cautious, quick-thinking souls in the world, none matched his gift for turning a story to his own advantage, and she promised him that her protection, which had followed him in secret since the walls of Troy, was not yet finished. There was still a household to reclaim, she told him, still suitors crowding his own hall and courting his own wife in his absence, still one final trial waiting before his long story could truly end. But Poseidon's decade of pursuit, the storms and the shipwrecks, the lost fleet and the lost years, was over. The god who had sworn to make him arrive late and broken and alone had, in the strictest sense, kept every word of that vow. Odysseus had returned after 10 years of wandering rather than a few short weeks, and he had returned with nothing left of the 12 ships and the hundreds of men who had once sailed with him out of Troy. But he had returned, and that, in the end, was the one outcome that even a god's decade of fury had not been able to prevent. It is worth asking, now that the story has reached its shore, what the ancient Greeks who first told it around their own hearts believed it meant. They did not tell the story of Odysseus simply as an adventure, thrilling as it is even now, thousands of years later. They told it as a meditation on the terms under which mortal life had to be lived, in a world where the gods were real, were near, and were never entirely to be trusted or entirely to be defied. Odysseus survived not because he was stronger than Poseidon, for no mortal could ever be that, but because his cleverness, his endurance, and above all his refusal to give up bought him just enough time and just enough favour from one god to outlast the fury of another. The very qualities that had angered Poseidon in that cave, the pride, the wit, the need to be known and remembered, were the same qualities that had first won him Athena's love, and it was that love, patient and unwavering across 10 long years, that ultimately saved him. The Greeks understood their world as a balance of powers, both human and divine, and Odysseus' survival was proof that even the angriest god's grudge had its limits, so long as a mortal had one steady friend among the immortals who refused to let him drown. The story left its mark on more than myth. Sailors across the ancient Mediterranean poured libations to Poseidon before every voyage for 1,000 years afterward, not out of love, but out of the same fear Odysseus had learned the hard way, that the sea remembered every insult and forgot nothing. The very language of the Odyssey seeped into the language of the Greeks themselves, giving us the word Odyssey, still used today for any long and difficult journey marked by suffering and return. Homer's epic was recited, copied, and taught for centuries, studied by Roman schoolboys and Byzantine scholars, translated into every language of Europe, and its shape, the wandering hero, the faithful wife waiting at home, the long-delayed and hard-won homecoming, still echoes through nearly every story of exile and return that has been told since. If you sail today along the coast of western Greece, past the rocky, unassuming little island still called Ithaca, you are sailing waters that generations of ancient listeners once believed had truly swallowed a king's entire fleet, one ship at a time, at the command of a god who could not let go of a single, bitter prayer. We began this story with a man clinging to a broken plank, watching the sky darken with a fury that felt, and truly was, personal. We can see him more clearly now, not simply as a castaway battered by an anonymous storm, but as the target of a very old, very patient grudge, one that began the moment he could not resist turning back to shout his own name across the water. That single, prideful choice, more than any monster or any storm, was what bound him to Poseidon's wrath for 10 long years. And it was the quiet, unseen presence of another god entirely, watching from Olympus, calming winds, hiding him in mist, guiding a princess's dreams and a shepherd's raft alike, that made sure the story ended not with a drowned king lost at sea, but with a man asleep at last on his own native shore, his war finally, fully over. Thank you for joining me on this long journey tonight through the wine-dark waters of an old and unforgiving world. I hope the story of Odysseus, and of the god who never forgot him, has carried you somewhere far from the noise of the present. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.